The afternoon was quiet and very still. I was lying on the narrow peasant bed, looking at the glorious yellow lemon tree outside my window. In the distance came the fainter and fainter song of a marching company. We were past the days of Sidi Pass and Castoria, the passage through the Gulf of Corinth, and the great victory parade at Athens. We had advanced through the pages of history: Corinth, Delphi, Thessaly, the radiant Acropolis. Everywhere cheering crowds, happy and relieved. We felt the sigh of relief welling up from men, women, and even children, because we had arrived, and not the Italians. Once again we had been swept by a wave of happiness, as so many times before, in Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Our tanks had rolled on a carpet of Bulgarian roses. We had drunk wine with Macedonian peasants and shared their bread and salt. The Balkan campaign was over. However, despite our pride, we could not avoid a shadow of discontent. We knew only too well that the Italians were but a few days' march behind us. Their army was proudly communicating the capture of towns and villages we had surrendered to them. I could not forget the look of that old woman in Monsoon, who, looking with horror at the waving feathers of the Baleri, had said to me in an incomprehensible tone, "So that's it then. This is a bad thing you Germans have done." Suddenly, I was jolted out of my sleep. The roof was swaying with a jump. I climbed out of the window and was caught in the wide branches of the lemon tree. An earthquake in Lissa, but it didn't last long. A few short tremors, and then the earth quieted and was silent. Then the peasant family came running up to my tree, crossing themselves in signs of the cross in unbridled enthusiasm and shouting at me, not caring that I didn't understand a word. Shaking my head, I left my involuntary perch, which reminded me of the happy days of my youth, and descended to earth to run to the company commander's office, where I found a great commotion. Our Alpine troops were crowded around the first sergeant, all talking at once. It took a moment before I realized it wasn't all about the earthquake. The men had been listening to an enemy broadcast and had come to ask me if it was true what they were saying, that Rudolf Hess, the Führer's deputy, had parachuted into Britain. Of course, it seemed like the greatest folly. We mocked those battle-hardened infantrymen of the Styria Light and the Bavarian Alps. They left unconvinced. The night brought the confirmation. Rudolf Hess had jumped into an enemy country. He wanted to achieve peace, but in vain. Needless to say, we were astonished, moved by the breath of an unknown terror. Everyone talked without listening. Finally, we fell into an uncomfortable silence. The next morning the commander called me in to give me a top-secret order. He hesitated for a moment and cleared his throat before saying, "Get all the information you can about Soviet Russia and the part of Poland occupied by Russia in 1939. We are moving east. We are going to end this eternal threat." My first reaction was horror. I remembered H.'s words in Mein Kampf about a war on two fronts. Then I remembered the statement that was made after the signing of the pact with Russia, a pact which was a shock, especially to the National Socialists, but which in fact had simply taken into account the actual facts of the situation. And now all that was going to be thrown out. It was really a threat, one of the most serious threats, not only to Germany, but to the whole world. But did it have to be now, before we finished with the others? Another bloody war on two fronts. Most of my friends had been horrified by the pact with the Kremlin, but he had felt a sense of relief that it would have been an achievement worthy of the Iron Chancellor himself. It was what he would have done: grab the bull by the horns, break the siege, if there was no other option. If it had to be war, at least let him wait until we had secured our backs. But suddenly, all of that was being swept away. Then I thought, this is complete nonsense. He's acting. It's not true. It can't be true. But it was true enough, and it was inevitable. When there were only a few German divisions securing the eastern border, the Red Army was concentrating all its strength. The men didn't care at all. They didn't care. They were used to marching, fighting, dying if necessary, but always as victors. It was not often that anyone stopped to think about things. In Vienna I met a friend, a man closely connected with the Foreign Ministry's information service. He refused to see him. He was furious, and didn't even want to see him once. Who the hell stopped him? He stopped in the corridor and told him that the Führer's mind was made up, that his decision was irrevocable, and that he could not even be received. Schulenberg was furious, said that it was not as if he had committed a crime, that his information was of the utmost importance, but Ribbentrop barely let him speak. It simply was not going to happen, no matter what he said. The Führer's decision had already been made. I was silent for a while, and then said angrily, This is all nonsense. You journalists let your imaginations run wild. It would do you good to get out and see us for a while. You'd forget all this soon enough." He nodded. "I'm going to do it as soon as I can. I wish you were right, and it was just a TOWN rumour, but it's gone beyond that. It's almost an official story." I said goodbye to my mother, and then used the rest of my brief leave to pay a quick visit to my former boss, Gitter Joseph Burke. He was in excellent spirits and radiated confidence. "Send me a postcard from Moscow," was his cheerful farewell. "Your guys won't waste any time, and then watch out for England." When the news broke that the war against the Soviet Union had begun, Adolf Hitler was in Brun. There was almost a mutiny in the ranks. Although the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's elite corps, is commonly considered a division, it did not officially gain that status until after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. It changed its name several times during the war years, ending with the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. In the text, it will be referred to simply as the Leibstandarte. Brun is the German name for the present-day city of Brno in the Czech Republic, which at the time was heavily populated by ethnic Sudeten Germans and ethnic Germans. In the east, in Silesia, we found people cheering and waving their hands everywhere, crowds almost frantic with joy. Old veterans of the First Russian campaign spent hours beside our resting columns, giving us advice on how to eliminate the Kaks and Russian infantry. Women stocked us with food and cigarettes, too much to take with us, even to consume on the spot. Girls we did not know hugged us and covered us with kisses. But soon our nostrils were filled with the stench of burning villages. The air trembled with the distant booming of cannons, and our hearts beat faster, even though we were used to war. Tomorrow's battle never fails to oppress the heart. The division had been on the march since dawn for hours, passing by smouldering houses. We saw the first dead lying by the roadside. The troops watched them closely, with fury and growing excitement. They were the bodies of men from the Siberian and Mongol regiments, men whom the staggering giant of a nation had torn from their homes in the east and thrown to defend its threatened frontier in the west. The din of battle echoed close behind us. Waves of enemy armour had pushed deep into enemy territory, advancing along the northern route where they had come within sight of Kiev. Once the enemy recovered from the impact of our first attack, their forces advanced in waves in front of, behind and on both sides of our armour, which looked like a huge porcupine in the midst of the surrounding chaos, short of fuel and without ammunition supplies. Our division's mission was to clear the enemy's northern route and allow fuel to reach the armoured spearheads. So far, we had seen nothing of the Red Air Force in the woods through which we were advancing. The first Soviet artillery shells hit the ground, but stopped almost as quickly as they had come. The battalion commander called his liaison officer. "I want you to scout the approaches to the northern route. Take a couple of men with you." The young SS Unterführer turned and pointed to me, who was in the rear of the vehicle. We moved through rolling terrain, where fields of grain stretched out before us, seemingly deserted. Farms with blue and brown washed walls and yellow thatched roofs appeared from time to time. The officer looked at the map suddenly and turned to me, who was crouched in the back of the vehicle. He said in a strained voice, "The map is wrong." I looked up at him in amazement and saw beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. We had long since lost sight of everyone and had advanced about 10 kilometres into enemy territory. All was quiet and peaceful, like a quiet Sunday morning. Even the sound of distant tank fighting had stopped. It seemed as if the church bells were due to ring at any moment. We sped up a steep hill from which we could see deep into the terrain. In the distance, almost on the horizon, was a broad ribbon of grey. Clouds of dust rose and disappeared. The officer said, "The north road ahead, the columns." We looked back to where we had been, and in the meantime the dust had vanished. In the meantime it became dark. We continued to advance and advance. There was no sign of the enemy. The men were cheerful and in good spirits. I heard a sergeant say, "He'll be in Moscow in 6 weeks if Ivan moves fast enough." I was sitting in the vehicle looking out the window, my heart beating frantically as I desperately fought my feverish state. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I was certainly no stranger to war and knew what was going on. Our task was to avert the danger from the east, to crush it and end it once and for all. Yet faced with this vast expanse of land, I was overcome with a sense of abandonment and fear of falling into a trap. Of course it was ridiculous. Our armies had triumphed everywhere. The furious advance of our tanks had destroyed the enemy wherever he was and swept him before us. Gradually the air became clearer, and visibility improved. The haze of the day had disappeared. Night was closing in over the wide plain, and in the forests and deep swamps we passed through the first shadows of night emerged. A shout of jubilation went through the battalion. We had reached the main route of advance. Beside us stood the ramparts of the Ukrainian forests. The singing and music had long since fallen silent. Not a shot could be heard any more. We continued to advance, with our vehicle in the second position in the column. Gradually, the darkness of night closed in on us. The company commander instructed us to move forward with the motorcycle sidecar to explore a crossroads. It was a mission where we needed to maneuver with ease. The young NCO nodded and nodded to me. He pointed to me, who was in the back of the vehicle. We moved across the rolling terrain, with fields of grain stretching out before us, seemingly deserted. From time to time, farmhouses with blue and brown washed walls and yellow thatched roofs appeared. A few more rounds echoed through the night. There was total confusion, and orders were given. The young liaison officer ran up beside me shouting, "Move! ALL company vehicles are to move forward on the side road and establish security at 360 degrees. I ran in search of the first company commander I could find. A few minutes later, the heavy vehicles were moving noisily, one behind the other, down the side road, away from that fateful intersection. Machine-gun bursts pierced our path, and the first wounded were screaming. The 3.7-centimetre flak self-propelled guns at the front of the column were advancing like huge ploughs through the grain field at night. Machine-gun sections formed the continuous links between the self-propelled guns. Men crouched between the huge vehicles, trying to locate the enemy tanks. The tanks were advancing in spite of everything. They were light Soviet tanks. One of our vehicles caught fire, but miraculously it was extinguished immediately. It was an ammunition truck. The enemy fire became more intense, bursting and crashing around us from all sides. There was no longer any doubt we were surrounded. Along with other men I didn't know, I crouched in the ditch beside the road, firing randomly into the night. A cannon shot ripped through the night as we advanced, and the first wounded cried out. Disquiet reigned. Orders were given to fall back. Shadows closed in around us. Machine-gun bursts whistled in the darkness. Suddenly a figure broke out of the darkness a few yards away. "Look out!" I warned him. "There's a lot of iron in the air. I guess it's good for lung trouble." Then I saw him clearly, pulling out a grenade. "Ivan!" I shouted as loud as I could, as I threw myself to the ground. I had barely made it to the ground when the first bursts from Cole's machine-gun whistled inches from me. I watched the Russian collapse without a sound. I quickly jumped back into the ditch. I couldn't talk. I had joined in 1939, he said as if nothing had happened. SS leader in a small town, you know. I was supposed to be, but I was on the old side and my heart wasn't very good. So after basic training I went to the concentration camp guard units. "Well," I said, still in shock about what had happened. "Well, you say that's what I said at the time. I was disappointed, of course, but I was still hoping to get into action. Instead, I found myself on guard duty in a concentration camp for a year, you know. Much of what is said is not true, or at least exaggerated, but what is true is bad enough. People crowded together, confined for years in a small space. I became quite friendly with one of them, a Polish university professor. One day, while I was working with he went over to the wire and pleaded with me in a low voice, "Please kill me. I can't take it any more." "Stay where you are," I shouted back in horror, raising my rifle. "Those are our orders." But the desperate man could no longer see or hear me. He was already in another world. I was shaking all over. "Stay where you are, for God's sake. Stay where you are," he was telling her. "You know the orders." With his eyes closed, he crossed the line. I couldn't shoot. I was incapable. At that moment, the neighbouring guard opened fire. I wrote to the Reichsfuhrer. I wrote to everyone I knew who had influence. I wanted to get to the front-line forces. I didn't want to be a jailer. Finally, IT worked. "All this," he said, staring vacantly into the starry night, "is paradise after that. You get the jitters, you know." "You don't know what you're saying," I said uncomfortably. He just smiled. Gradually the Russians tightened their ring of death, and their fire became more intense. "Let's go," shouted an Untersturmführer. I didn't know. "We can get a few of them out of here without any trouble." He led Cole, me, and another up the sleeve. Ammunition for the infantry guns, the Untersturmführer stood on the back of a truck, and watched intently the nearby enemy gun flashes. He paid no attention to the enemy fires around us. He was the infantry gun platoon leader. Volkmarschutz had identified the firing position of the Russians and gave brief orders. Burst after burst howled through the night and crashed with a screech into the nearby enemy firing position. We breathed a sigh of relief. We loaded box after box of ammunition through the enemy fire to where the guns had positioned themselves in the deep field to our right. A heavy machine gun was close by, on the edge of the road, and every time it fired, the enemy fire ceased. Oberscharführer was directing the fire. I exchanged a casual word with him. When he praised us for how quickly we had brought up the ammunition, I crouched at his feet and lit a cigarette. Suddenly, an invisible hand struck him behind the knees, and he fell silently to the ground with a shot to the head, Cole muttered as we turned him over. That's how you want to die. The next non-commissioned in command jumped up and continued to direct fire. When we charged again, he was also lying next to his comrade. See, Cole said, lost in thought, his words cutting through my horror. This is what I always dreamed it would be. This is the real SS, not concentration camps, not Gestapo or SS Heights, but soldiers who fight and die when told. He paused. It's not about barbed wire and security zones. I was too puzzled to respond. A moment later, shells from a Soviet battery crashed into our defensive positions, but only once or twice, then silenced by salvos from our flak self-propelled guns and infantry guns. Towards dawn, rumour spread that all units of the division had been surrounded and that radio contact had been lost. Soon after, orders came from the battalion commander. An enemy attack is expected at dawn. No one can come to our aid. The battalion will hold the crossroads as ordered. No quarter will be asked or given. You saw the mutilated bodies of your comrades yesterday afternoon and know what to expect. Towards morning, the enemy fire suddenly ceased. We were all in our improvised trenches or sheltered in the vehicles. I stacked ammunition magazines next to me so that I had everything within easy reach. They would probably be enough for 2 hours. After that, it wasn't worth thinking about. Half an hour passed without a shot being heard. Our nerves were about to snap. If something would happen, if someone would come, we thought. But nothing happened. An hour passed and daylight broke through the sky. Good light for shooting, Carl said as he lit his pipe. I looked down the wide road to the west. I squinted to get a better look, but it was impossible. I ran feverishly toward the commanding officer's shelter. German forces on bicycles are coming from the west, I reported breathlessly. He looked at me without a word, then raised his binoculars. Let's go, he roared, and we jumped onto the side motorcycle and raced down the line of surprised riflemen. An army major, slow and burly, clumsily hopped off his bike with a grin on his face. It's crazy, he said. They told me in the last town they'd heard gunfire around here all night, but I see everything is quiet. My commander cleared his throat. Pretty quiet, he said in a strangely thick voice. I've only got about 40 dead. The major's friendly face hardened, but my commander continued, It looks like the enemy has withdrawn. Shortly thereafter we climbed back on the motorcycle and rode away to the east. Soon the sky darkened and a gentle rain began. The men were exhausted after their sleepless night, sitting wet and shivering in their combat vehicles. Above us came the sound of engines. At first we thought it was ours, but then bombs began to fall on our right. They had mistaken us for retreating Soviets. The men stood up and began shouting, cursing and waving their arms, but no one tried to take cover. Finally the good man realized his mistake, felt deeply ashamed, and rose abruptly to disappear. We did not have a single casualty. Our respect for the Luftwaffe had not increased. Toward evening we realized that the narrow road along which we were advancing was leading us to our objective, the northern route of advance. We were close to the division's armoured assault unit, which indicated that something was afoot. We pressed on, occasionally hearing gunfire, but no one stopped. It would have taken too long, and by now we all knew what our mission was. The tanks had advanced to within a few kilometres of Kiev, where they had run out of fuel with little food and ammunition. The Russians were closing ranks and trapping our tanks. Supply convoys could not get through, as the main supply route was in enemy hands. Our mission was to liberate it and give the tanks a breathing space. We continued to advance. At 4 o'clock in the morning we crossed the old Russian border. That same morning we experienced our first Russian air attack, 30 to 40 planes at a time. We suffered 2 killed and several wounded. By afternoon we were attacking outside the village of Romanova, facing stubborn Russian resistance. The enemy was repulsed. That night I saw no action. We established our camp on a large collective farm. Most of the livestock on the farm had been shot by the retreating Russians. It was there that I first spoke with ethnic Germans. A young woman brought us milk and honey. "Are any of your men from the Palatinate?" she asked. Unfortunately, we had to tell her no. She told us that her family originally came from the Palatinate. We asked him what his life had been like. "Life? They got by until 1928. After that, my father was shot," he said in a tired voice. "He opposed the collective farm. Maybe he should have thought more about his family. But he always said we had paid for this piece of land with our own sweat and money, and no one was going to take it away from us. That's why he was shot for sabotaging the revolution. 2 of my brothers got 10 years. We never heard from them again." His younger brother once wrote from Utk, but nothing since then. "Mother abandoned us. Her mind broke and she hanged herself. Hans, my husband, was taken away a month ago to dig trenches. I wonder if I'll ever see him again. I doubt it. So I was left alone with 3 children, the 3 youngest, 2 girls and a boy, clinging timidly to their mother's skirt. We looked at each other. What surprised us was the way this young woman told her story, as if it were little more than trivial village gossip. We listened in disbelief. An elderly Ukrainian man spoke up. He had been a prisoner in Austria during World War I and knew a few words in German. "You must not think that only ethnic Germans suffer," he said with difficulty. 5 years in prison for being late for work twice. I have no watch and I live far from the collective farm. My brother was killed," he said it in the same indifferent tone, as if talking about a bad harvest. I said, "You tell us these horrible stories and you don't seem the least bit upset." The Ukrainian smiled. "Do you know what it's like to live near death? Nothing is as great as it seemed at first." We didn't know what to reply. There was nothing more to say. We continued our advance the next day. We passed through huge pine forests, fertile hills and extensive swamps, and moved deeper and deeper into the endless land. Destroyed bridges forced us to detour, but we continued on our course toward the northern route of advance. Finally, on July 11th, we reached our desired objective, the main road. The leading companies rested in the dense vegetation and hills immediately in front of us. The assault guns were about 9 kilometers away, and suddenly a German sergeant appeared on the road without cap and belt, with a P8 pistol in his hand. As he wiped the blood from his face, he reported, "An army motorcycle unit had been surrounded for 3 days in the village of Sof, 3 kilometers north of the main road. He had been sent in a last-ditch attempt to get help, and had spent all night infiltrating through the Soviet lines. Finally he was spotted and shot, but he had made it through by a miracle. A few minutes later, assault guns loaded with infantry were heading for Sof, and the sergeant was in the first one. We had moved a little way down the road when an anti-tank gun fired before the first gun could respond and began to burn. The second gun moved forward and silenced the enemy anti-tank gun at point-blank range. We advanced a few more yards toward the town and came immediately under enemy fire. The infantry slipped out of the guns and took up positions in the ditch beside the road. I flattened myself against the ground, facing in the direction from which the enemy fire must have come. The assault guns were firing indiscriminately into the open field. Suddenly I saw a head poke out of the roof window of the building in front of me. I found myself looking directly into the eyes of a Russian, who was preparing a machine gun to fire at our comrades in a trap about 30 meters behind me. I raised my rifle and took aim. The building was no more than 10 meters away. As he raised his machine gun, I pulled the trigger. The man staggered, and I clearly saw blood dripping from his forehead. I remained where I was, motionless, unable to move. The men around me jumped out of the ditch and crossed the road to the building. One of them gave me a little tap as he said, "Are you okay?" I stood up, shaking, and wiped the sweat from my forehead. My knees were weak. I had killed a man for the first time in my life, coldly and deliberately. The next few minutes had the quality of a dream. I saw myself running down the village street with the others. To our right, an assault gun was firing its main gun and machine gun as it advanced. Then I was looking at sweaty, dirty faces, faces full of joy, dozens of hands stretched out toward me, a slim, elegant officer. His immaculate uniform made a strange contrast to his surroundings. He drew me toward him headlong into a shelter. "I killed one," I gasped, then pulled myself together. The howitzer lieutenant, a man considerably older than 50, gave me a hard look, then smiled. "Shoot faster, son. You'll have more time to live." I settled next to him and raised my rifle, firing into an open area where brown figures were running back and forth. I followed suit. I heard the officer say, "You did well. We were practically finished. I won't forget your division for a long time." Meanwhile, the leader of the assault gun section had assessed the situation and radioed for reinforcements. Soon, the entire assault gun battery was headed for Sof, and the Russians retreated under pressure. "Have you eaten?" the howitzer lieutenant suddenly asked me. "No," I replied. "Then you will be my guest," I said. I stared at him speechless, and then tried to straighten my muddy uniform. A soldier served the howitzer lieutenant and his assistant, a burly major, white paper napkins and proper white soup bowls with meat and vegetables. It was like a fairy tale. During the meal, the howitzer lieutenant continually received company reports and issued orders. The meal over, I stood up and asked permission to go to my comrades, who were in a gorge about 100 yards away. As I turned to leave, I looked in the direction from which we had come that morning and saw several dozen yellowish steel hulks on the edge of the grain field. "Ivanez behind us," I said quickly. The howitzer lieutenant smiled incredulously. "They're probably your reinforcements," he replied. I looked closer. Our camouflaged helmet covers don't glow in the sun. He stiffened and stood in the open field, a small pistol in his belt and white leather gloves. "More to the right, men, many more to the right, and aim better. Silence that machine gun, Franz, give him some blasts." He directed the machine gunner hesitantly. I stood up too and watched as the howitzer lieutenant stood in the open field 3 paces from where I was lying, a lean, clean, sleek officer in the midst of combat. His immaculate uniform contrasted strangely with his surroundings. "More to the right, men, many more to the right, and aim better. Silence that machine gun, Franz, give it some bursts," he directed the hesitant machine gunner. I also stood up and watched as the howitzer lieutenant stood in the middle of the field, just 3 paces from where I lay. It continued to climb and made another turn. Enemy shells again fell on our positions. Only then did the plane take off. It must have fallen into Ivan's hands at some point, and now he was using it against us with all its German markings. By late afternoon, the enemy had been routed and forced to retreat into the Rito swamps. Although the men of the battalion were acting like heroes, another huge concentration of Red Army men advanced from the woods north of the road and crossed a grain field at dawn. When dawn broke, Schutz's platoon of infantry guns fired ricocheting shells into them, and the results were frightening. Working with the platoon of the reconnaissance battalion, it was possible to stop and then eliminate the Russian thrust. The Russians who had penetrated the 1st Battalion sector were defeated. The casualties the Red Army had to suffer were so heavy that its offensive efforts were derailed, and the division was able to gain more and more ground. Marshal Boudinny's plan to completely encircle our right flank had failed. Finally, there was a rest day in the village of Mosin, where I met the first Ukrainian industrial workers I had ever seen. They were employees of a neighbouring pottery, and one of them, a Pole, spoke good German. I was eager to talk to people from what one might expect to be the elite class within this workers' paradise. "How do we live? That's not hard to count," he said in response to my question. "We get about 400 rubles a month. A pair of shoes costs 500 to 600 rubles, and a suit costs at least 600 rubles. Bread costs 9 rubles a loaf, and meat costs 15 rubles. "But no one can live on that," I said in amazement. The Pole shrugged. "They don't worry about that," he said. "The director gets 3,000, of course, and the engineers at least 1,500. I began to wonder if I was hearing correctly. Not only that," he continued, "our stores have different prices and products than those used by engineers, managers, and party members. As a worker, you can't just shop wherever you want, but only at the cooperative you have been assigned. Nor can you buy whatever you want, only what you have been assigned. The NKVD, Red Army officers and party leaders have other establishments. We don't even know what they get there, but they look good and dress well enough, unlike us," said an elderly German woman who had made her way through the crowd. "And if you are allowed to buy a dress once a year, and that often costs more than 400 rubles, maybe you want a green one, size 2, the seller takes a red one, size 4 off the hook, because there is no other choice, and you are happy to have something for what you have saved for a whole year." But I said, "You have a proletarian democracy. Why don't you do something about it?" There was a general silence for a moment, and then the small crowd that had gathered burst out laughing. The Pole had tears in his eyes. He thought my comment was so funny. The voting lists always have Joseph Stalin and Molotov at the top. Then come the members of the Central Committee, and then come the local candidates of the bloc of communists and independents, all on one list, the only one allowed. It is all laid down in the election laws of 1936, drawn up by Stalin himself. There is no other list of candidates to vote for, and not to vote is nothing but a little dangerous. It's called high treason, so if you value your life and your freedom, you hand in your vote along with the others. That's what they call proletarian democracy. The ethnic German women continued, freely elected deputies represent the 16 Soviet republics and 631 paid lackeys sit in the Supreme Soviet. Another 650 sit in the Soviet of Nationalities. The 53 ministers and 33 members of the government are nothing more than departmental bureaucrats. All decisions are made by the 14 men of the Politburo of the Central Committee, and these men decide the fate of 200 millions. But they are not appointed to their posts by the millions whom they govern, nor by the 6 million members of the party, but solely and exclusively on the orders of Joseph Stalin. His is the most absolute dictatorship history has ever known. Next to him, the Tsar and even Napoleon were like children. What those Caesars tried to do, he has achieved. He has established his dictatorship over doing and being, over sleeping and waking, over giving birth and children, over families themselves, over thought and word, even over silence and life and death. He alone is the master, responsible to no one, not even to his own conscience, because he has none, the old woman continued. And this, the old woman continued, is what the outside world calls proletarian democracy. To what extent the fraud has succeeded is evident from your question, German soldier. But within Russia itself, it has reached the point where men and women are starving and wish that all is well, that such is life. They cherish their chains, never having known anything different. Our conversation was interrupted by the order to move on. That night, we stopped in a village of considerable size. As soon as the locals saw that I was trying to establish contact with them, hundreds of men and women gathered around me. A smart young man grabbed my arm and said, "For years we Ukrainians have been suffering and dying. Now it is our turn. We don't want anything from you Germans. We are ready to do anything. Just give us rifles, give us ammunition." In his excitement, his last words came out in Ukrainian, and the crowd became frenzied. "Pushka! Pushka!" they shouted. I answered them. "I'm just an ordinary soldier," deeply moved by their emotion. "I hope you get your wish." The young man continued, "Look, Pan, my father was an old Bolshevik who was sent to Siberia by the Tsar because he believed in liberty, equality and fraternity. Later, he fought as a partisan, and we were very proud of him. But when he raised his voice in factory meetings against senseless terror and class distinctions in the distribution of food and goods, he disappeared and was never seen again. The same thing happened to the whole old guard. Suddenly, they became Trotskyites, saboteurs and traitors, and these men who had won power for the revolution and the workers' councils with their blood, you will be lucky if you find a dozen of them all over Ukraine. The rest of them have either been purged, branded as traitors and executed, or simply disappeared. They brought us freedom, the freedom to die if you don't submit. They brought us equality, an equality with class distinctions that could not be more rigid under the worst capitalist regime. The man who does not belong to the party does not get a special identification card, and the man without a card barely gets enough to live on. They also brought us fraternity, the fraternity of the commissars, and the bullet in the back. When the crowd heard the word commissar, they went wild. A crippled old man pointed to his hunched back and said, "Me, the sheriff." A young woman pointed to her 2 younger children. 2 younger women carried an older Ukrainian woman to us on a primitive stretcher. She gripped my hands tightly with her slender fingers and repeated over and over in a passionate whisper some phrases I could not understand. It was the wife of our village priest. The young man continued in a low voice, "When the Red Army retreated, the commissars rounded up all the unreliable peasants and executed them. The woman's eyes stared at me. Ours is a priest, and his 2 sons were also among them. The youngest was 8 years old. She was prostrated by shock and is now paralyzed. She wants you Germans to take revenge. She wants you Germans to take revenge 100 times for each of your children." "Pushka! Pushka!" they all shouted, men and women, overwhelmed by the intensity of their passion. I pressed the many hands reaching out to me and walked away without a word. So much for today's video. Remember to subscribe and leave your like so we keep bringing content for all of you. See you next time.